Everybody, so for those who don't know me, my name is Joe Nabnett. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Northern Iowa, and I have a degree in psychology from the U. I am an amateur scholar of Norse mythology. That means that nothing I say is true. No, just kidding. That means that if you have a background in this field and I say something really stupid, feel free to correct me, because I would prefer being right over being wrong. So feel free to interject. So tonight, we're going to be talking about Norse mythology. What does that mean? So, talk overview. Whoops, that is out of order. So, we're going to be talking about two things and possibly a third thing. First, we're going to talk about Norse religion. How did they practice their faith? What did it look like? What were their rituals? After that, we're going to talk about Norse mythology. What were some of their stories, and what did they mean, and what did we think they mean? We're going to go through some of their myths. I'm going to tell them to you in dramatic fashion. I'm actually going to read a couple of them, and we're going to speculate on their meanings and go from there. And if we have time, if you guys aren't totally bored of listening to my voice, we might talk about Norse ontology and existentialism. The last two times I gave this talk, it was primarily about ontology and existentialism, and that took the entire time. So I pushed it to the very end because I think these things are maybe more fun to talk about now. So learning a mythology or learning about a new religion is like learning a new language. So how many people are fluent in multiple languages that they learned throughout the course of their lives? Anybody? Anybody? Good. So... No. So if you're fluent in multiple languages, something you probably picked up along the way is that when you speak a language and you immerse yourself in that language, it's not enough to just carry around a dictionary and swap out words for the new language. You have to get an understanding of what it's like to be a person who speaks that language. You have to understand their culture, the context, the history a little bit. Otherwise, it doesn't really make any sense, or you can only make sense of it so far. And religion is the exact same way. You can't just swap out the gods and the holidays and say it's just like, Christianity, but Jesus is Odin and they have Yule instead of Christmas. It doesn't really work that way. It's more complex. You have to be careful also to not project your own ideas or ideas that come naturally to you because of where you're born onto someone else's religion, because that leads to misinterpretation and miscommunication. So you have to keep in mind when you try to interpret a story, am I getting this idea from Christianity or from some other religion, or do I just not understand? Norse religion is even harder because it doesn't exist anymore. We cannot go and ask them what they believed, what they did. We can only speculate, and we can only use the limited evidence we have from old texts, from archaeology, and from history. A note on empathy. So before we move on to talk about this strange religion, I want to make very clear several things. First of all, pagan religion and worldview was radically different from Christianity, from Islam, from Judaism, from probably any religion you've ever heard of that exists today. It's so different that sometimes it's almost unintelligible. Like, it makes no sense. It goes against our common sense. It goes against things that seem self-evident to us. And it's not because it's wrong so much as because the ideas are just lost to time, right? And so, things that seem self-evident, yeah, I said that. The religion that they practiced was built into the language that they spoke. It's literally impossible to separate it from them without force. Just speaking in the language, Old Norse, in the 9th century AD, would have involved all of these different metaphors and kennings and ideas that come from their religion, and you can't just separate them because it's in the words they speak. Some of those words are still around today. For example, in English, when we talk about the loud rumble that you hear after lightning, we call it thunder. Well, the word thunder is just the evolution of a word from Old English that was called thunder, which meant the exact same thing, but was also the name of their thunder god. It was also their name for Thor. So if you were a person in Anglo-Saxon England in the 5th century, and you heard thunder and you said, "Ich hear thunder," I hear thunder, that would have meant exactly the same thing as saying both, I hear the sound thunder and I hear the thunder god. Like, you can't separate them, which, is weird, right? But that's just the way it was. Some things are literally impossible for us to understand. For example, this is a controversial statement, but these people did not think of time as a linear series of events. They did not think of time as a line. They thought of time as a circle. Okay? So, how does that make sense? It doesn't make sense. It sounds like nonsense coming out of my mouth right now. But that is built into the language they speak and into all their stories. Like, that is how they perceived and transmitted their experience of the world, right? It seems totally nonsense to us, but that made sense to them, right? So, but in spite of all these things that make them so different from us, they were people just like us. They were no less capable of being smart, of being interesting, of having profound insights. They laughed, they told jokes, they drank a lot. They, loved to tell stories. They had dreams and hopes and all the things that we do. They just had a very different religion and worldview from us. So, my hope with this talk is not just to make people laugh and, scratch their heads at a bunch of weird stories, but to try to have a sense of empathy for people who practiced a very different religion. Because, believe it or not, that comes in handy in modern times, too. So, and it applies also to some religions that still exist today. So, keeping that in mind, and for many of us, they were family. Most of us Midwesterners, we have long lines of Germans and Scandinavians going far back who probably believed in Thor and Odin and all these interesting gods. And, because of them, because of the things they did, we got to be here, right? So, they were a lot like us. So, going forward, who were these people? So, people who believed in this religion, which the overarching term is Germanic religion, were Germanic peoples. That means they spoke the Germanic languages, and they had a series of customs and ideas that were Germanic that they shared in common between them. This is a modern spread of where the descendants of Germanic peoples live now. So you have Austrians, Germans, the Dutch, and the English. Those are kind of the Low German peoples. And then up here you have the Scandinavians, the Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and then you have the Icelanders way up there. What distinguishes Norse mythology from Germanic mythology in general is time and space. So, Germanic mythology south of Scandinavia, these people all converted to Christianity around the years 300, 400, 500 AD, whereas these people converted to Christianity around the year 800, 900, 1000. The Icelanders officially converted to Christianity in the year 1000, and they kind of lingered in this in-between time for 100 years afterward. And so the Norse myths were also written down. They were almost all written down after the fact, but nevertheless, we have almost nothing from the Germans and the English and the Austrians, but we have a large variety of texts and stories that come from the Icelanders especially, but also from Norway and from Sweden. And so we group those together, and they become their own thing. Their religion was not monolithic, so they had no central church, there was no prophet, there was no supreme authority, there was no single text that was handed down from the gods that told the truth. Everywhere you went, the religion was a little bit different, had its own customs that were a little different, had its own linguistic differences. It was highly localized, so people in different tribes would They would all be aware of kind of the main gods and the main ideas, but they would have their own local gods as well that other tribes wouldn't care about. For example, the Saxons worshipped a god called Saxnaught, which means sword friend. And he was thought to be not like a founder of their tribe, but he was thought to be like a great warrior who helped them to conquer the Britons. He probably wasn't a real person, but for them, he was their own god. Frey, for the Swedes, they believed that all of their kings were descended from Frey. And so they had a unique sort of Frey-focused worship in their country, especially in Gotland. Syncretism. So these people did not have a concept that there was one true religion and all other religions were wrong. That didn't make sense to them. So when they ran into other places, they would take their religious customs, like, all right, why not? So, like when the Saxons were in the employ of the Romans, they saw that the Romans worshipped a god called Saturn, and they thought, this is cool, we're going to worship Saturn too. And so they named their Saturday, they named their 6th day of the week Saturday, as opposed to washing day, which is what it is in all the other Scandinavian languages. So there are subtle linguistic differences. So in England, they worshipped a god called Woden, and in the Scandinavian countries, they worshipped a god called Odin. These are the same god, sort of. They have the same ancestral root, and they serve basically the same function, but the linguistics make a big difference. So the first part of Odin is, in the Scandinavian words, it would be Other, which means poet, inspiration. The first part of Woden, Wod, or Wode, means crazy, insane, freak. And so, when you... So comparing those two gods, you have that subtle difference that's purely linguistic. It's just the vowels shifting, but it's changed the way that people would have thought of their god, because Woden is crazy and Odin is a poet, right? So we don't have a centralized religion, and we also do not have a continuous, complete set of texts. What we do have are a large number of myths, stories, depictions, and pieces of archaeology that depict Germanic gods and characters and heroes and stories. They come from different places and different times, from Germany in the 4th century to Iceland in the 10th century, and they all sort of share a family resemblance. There are recurring themes, images, stories. We know that they all worshipped Thor, even though they had different names, and there were kind of subtle differences in the language and in some of the stories, but it was still the same God, right? Just like Christianity in the U.S. looks different from Christianity in other places. Some gods reoccur, family resemblance. I'm repeating myself. So, moving on. It's hot. Jesus. How's everybody doing? Everybody having fun? I'm having fun. Talking about stuff I love. So, Norse religion. Religion is the practice, right? So it's not too abstract. It's what did they do? What did their rituals look like? What were some of their customs? Here we have this idol of Thor that is from 9th century Iceland. So it's very old. It's very cool. As you see, he has a very impractical looking hammer in his lap. Well, no, he's resting his bearded chin on it. Yeah, like he can't quite see it, but like he's sitting on a chair. Yeah. So what did their religion look like? The short answer is we don't know much. We have a limited amount of detail. These people didn't write. They had writing, but they didn't use it to record history or things like that. But we do have later writing that casually references things. We have descriptions from other people. So the longer answer is we don't know much, but we have enough to speculate and to form a skeleton. And we can compare with living religions and other ancient religions that have a similar basis and kind of fill in the gaps. So Norse religion was animistic. What does animism mean? Animism is the belief that inanimate objects, souls, and natural phenomena, inanimate objects, plants, and natural phenomena have souls, right? Or they're animated by a spirit or by some supernatural force. So this applies to everything: rocks, trees, grass, blades of grass, rivers, poles, hills, mountains. All those things have souls or spirits in an animistic religion, right? Norse pagans believed that everything in the world had a spirit, and nothing in nature can be truly dead. So when you look at a rock, when I look at a rock, at least, I don't think it's alive. I think it's dead, right? Because that seems self-evident to me. But they would look at the rock and they would say it's just moving really slowly, right? And that was the way they viewed everything. And so if you killed something, it still wasn't dead. You killed its body, but it was still part of this process of change and becoming, right? Because the body's going to rot, and the influence of the thing is going to keep going. It's a very sort of long, drawn-out process. It's similar to the concept of kami in the Japanese indigenous religion Shinto, and also to Hindu faiths and some forms of Native American religion. Supernatural does not exist. All spirit and spirituality are earth-based. So, in the Christian worldview, there's a distinction between things that are holy and supernatural and things that are natural, right? Things that are natural are dead matter that is animated by laws that are made by God, right? And things that are holy are things that are separate from the world that intervene from without. So it might be, angels swooping down to rescue people. That's a holy thing. Well, for these people, trees were holy, and rocks were holy, and statues were holy, because for them, there was no distinction between nature and supernature. It was all sort of smushed together. So I have this lovely Theodore Kittelson painting. So you have the swamp, and there's this lump of grass out there, and it's got spooky eyes. It's like the river spirit. So that's kind of how they would have seen it, but not really, because they wouldn't have needed the eyes to think that the river had a spirit. You have the spooky hill spirit. I like this one too. He's even got one eye, so he's kind of like Odin. Oh, I never made that connection before. Now that painting is ruined for me. Oh, Greg! At the bar. Millions and millions of gods. So, in other animistic faiths, sometimes people today are confused by statements like, there are 33 million Hindu gods. And they think, how the hell do they even keep track of all of them? Well, the answer is that it's not a specific number. It means that there's an infinite number of gods, right? In Shinto, in an ancient text, it says there are 8 million kami. Kami is a word in Japanese that we, if we translate it to English, it translates to God. But we usually just say kami because we think of it as kind of its own concept. But the expression 8 million in that context just means a lot, right? Basically like an infinite number. So the idea is that you can find gods anywhere, right? If I wanted to start worshiping that table, I could do it right now, right? I could worship that table and that table and that table, see? And so they could just go on forever. I could worship an infinite number of tables if I wanted to. And so that's the way it works. Norse religion is basically the same way in that there is an infinite number of possible spirit beings that they would have worshipped. The difference is that in Shinto, they don't distinguish between kami and other spirits. There are just good kami and bad kami, great kami, like the sun god, Amaterasu, I think I'm pronouncing that wrong, I apologize, and lesser kami, like the ones you find in rocks. right? But in Norse religion, they have different titles for different kinds of spirits. So their gods are called the Aesir. The wicked spirits are called the Ettins or the Jotuns or the giants. There are dwarves and elves and land spirits, things like that. These spirits were sometimes called Elfar or Elves. There are many other words to describe them, but elf is the most fun, obviously. As I said, the line between these different kinds of spirits, it's not very specific. So the difference between an elf and a dwarf, for example, we don't really know. We know that when they talk about dwarves, they usually mean that they're underground, but we don't know that that's what makes it a dwarf, right? We know that the giants are evil, but sometimes the gods eat dinner with giants and get married to giants, and then those giants become gods. So the distinction is a little fuzzy. We have this lovely romance painting of elves dancing. 80% of Icelanders still believe in elves, according to Time magazine, or else they believe that they might exist. They believe that in rocks and trees and in sort of weird hills and stuff, there are elves, and that it is very bad luck to mess with these elves. So when they build roads and buildings, they take very special care to go around hills and rocks because they don't want to disturb the elves who are there. They also have this tradition where they build little elf houses out in the woods, and they call them elf houses, and they make little elf feasts, and they throw bread at them. It's really funny. It's an adorable tradition. Christianity and elves are not really compatible because, as I said, in the Christian worldview, there are not spirits going around on earth except for demons and angels. And so the belief that there are spirits in the rock means that you believe there are devils. And so the belief in elves gradually faded away. Although there are many traditions and myths and stories that people still talk about today that have to do with elves. For example, a lot of people in Wisconsin and some in Minnesota have this tradition that they don't understand, where at Christmas time, they make a big bowl of porridge and they set it on the back porch. They shut the door. And if you ask them why, they say, it's for the elves, for the Christmas elves. And you say, well, where did you learn about that? They'll say, I don't know, my dad did it, and my grandpa did it, so I do it too. So that's actually an extremely old tradition that goes all the way back to Viking times, right? And it's just been carried on because it's harmless and people thought it was fun. So, Norse religious practices, what we think we know. For the average person, the main objects of worship would have been their ancestors, local land spirits, and localized deities or heroes. So, this is not a religion where people are only concerned or even mostly concerned with gods, right? I like to think of it this way. When you need something from the U.S. government, do you call Barack Obama on his personal phone and say, I need a new driver's license? No. You go to the DMV and you wait in misery for a couple hours until the deed is done. You deal with these lower-level government officials. And it's kind of the same way with this. So, for daily things, I want help on my math test, or I want help, winning a contest. They would pray to their ancestors. If they wanted good luck, they didn't want a tree to fall on their house, they might make an offering to the tree, please don't fall on my house. And sometimes certain tribes would have their own set of heroes, right? They might have special characters from stories that they think are from their town or something, and they might have a special shrine to them, and that would be one of their favorite gods. Major deities like Odin and Thor and Frey would have been worshipped or invoked at specific times, but generally not in daily life. So specific times would include festivals, special rituals, certain occasions, like if you were a pregnant woman and you wanted to have a nice pregnancy, you might pray to Frigg. If you were, a warrior going to battle, you might pray to Odin. But in daily life, these gods would have been left out of it because they're too busy doing important things. Right? Some people may have been cultists or devotees of particular gods. Um, Sometimes, in some cultures, the king or the chieftain would kind of serve as the priest. It would be like a double duty. And in some cultures, they would have a separate priestly class, and these people would, do their own thing and be special priests. Or somebody might just decide, I'm going to be a special worshiper of a god. That was just kind of their thing. Depending on a person's profession, they might have had a patron god. So Odin would have been worshipped and feared by warriors and kings, poets, and philosophers, but not by farmers. Farmers just want him to stay away, right, because he's kind of spooky. They would have worshipped Frey, because Frey is the god who makes things grow and makes things fertile. Any mother would have worshipped Frigg at some point, but probably would not have been very interested in a god like Thor, who was a god for manly men. So, animation did not work. They practiced three main rituals in their religious practice. They practiced offerings, they practiced blots, or communal sacrifices, and they practiced toasting, or sumbel. So what are these things? So an offering is giving a gift to your ancestor, or to an elf, or to a specific god, or to everybody all at once. This was a personal, sort of individual activity. Gifts could include food items, alcohol, jewelry, weapons, or a live animal. And they would pray or bid for a favor from the spirit, and they would give the offering. And the idea is that the gift is going to be returned in an equal measure to the value of the gift. So if you give a crappy offering, you can expect a crappy gift back, right? If you give too much, though, that can be dangerous, because you might get more than you bargained for. In one of the wisdom poems, Odin warns that giving too much is better, or is worse than giving nothing at all. Okay. So, let me expand on that a little more. So, with a god like Odin, Odin is the god of wisdom. And how do you get wisdom? You get wisdom by suffering, through agony and pain. So if somebody just casually says, Odin, here is a solid gold bracelet, now I want wisdom, they might wake up like naked hanging in a tree or something the next day. That was the expectation, that the gift would be returned. Right? The Bloch. So the Bloch is a communal offering, usually as part of a festival or a holiday. It's different from the individual offering in that you can't do a blot with just one person. This is always a ritualistic festival sort of activity. Major blots would have included Yule, which is Christmas time or midwinter, the first day of summer, the winter nights, which is the start of winter in their calendar. By the way, they had a different calendar from us, or from the Roman calendar that people south of Scandinavia would have used. In their calendar, there are only two seasons, summer and winter, right? And the names of these seasons translate to mild and cold. It's pretty funny. Blot, the word just means blood, or blood sacrifice. So the people would all get together in the square, or wherever, and an animal, usually a pig or a horse, would be consecrated or hallowed to the gods by a priest, or Gothi, or a priestess, Githir. That means they would do magic signs over it or whatever, and then it would be, offered. Then they would kill the animal and pour the blood into bowls at the foot of the altar or the idol. They would take a sprig from a tree, and they would dip it in the blood, and they would sprinkle all the people who were there. And then the animal would be cooked and eaten by everybody in a communal feast. The idea is that by offering it to the god, by consecrating it, they imbue it with the god's blessing. So when they pour the blood on everybody and they all eat from the animal, the idea is that they're all getting blessed by the god, right? Every festival or particular sacrifice had its own set of rituals or traditions. The Yule blot was probably different from the summer blot. The fall blot was different from the victory blot, things like that. Some of the blots described in the primary sources were the Seeker blot, or the victory sacrifice. This was a group sacrifice at the beginning of the summer, and it was a sacrifice for victory because in Viking times they would go raiding in the summer, and so they would have their sacrifice and then they would sail off. Hopefully, that Odin would let them come back. The Elfavlot, or the elf sacrifice. We don't know much about this. All we know is that it was considered important. It's mentioned several times that you must always do the Elfavlot. But there's a funny anecdote with it because this Christian priest was going around preaching at people, and he knocks on these people's door, and it's in the winter. It's very cold, right? You'd think, and he thinks surely they'll let me in to warm up, right? Because these are nice folks. And so he bangs on their door. He says, "Let me in!" And this woman opens the door, and she goes, "You can't come in here. It's the Elfavlot." And shuts it on him. So it's like, all right. It's a very secretive thing, right? The Disablot, or the sacrifice to female spirits. The Aesir is a term for a group of spirits that are female, that follow people, or a group of people, or a group, or like a tribe or a family around, and protect them and give them blessings, things like that. A version of the Disablot survives to this day in Sweden in a big market that is called the Disting. Originally, it would have been called the Dis thing, or the Disablot thing, which was like a thing in Norse cultures was like a congress of sorts, or like a big market where everyone would get together. And toasting, or simbel. I just sort of combined all of the drinking rituals onto one page. So, drinking. So, these people loved drinking. It was a very normal part of their culture. It was something everybody did. It was something that young children did. It was something that they would do at every festival, at every big meal, every time somebody came to visit. And, if you didn't have any beer to give, you were considered a terrible host. So toasting is something we still do today. We might say, "Go Cubs," and then chug our drink, right? They would do something similar. They would make a toast to the gods, or to the ancestors, or to spirits, or to your friends, or to your favorite celebrity. And the idea is that by doing that, you're honoring them, right? Libations is another ritual that kind of survives today. A lot of people all over the world still pour libations. Nowadays, in the U.S., it pretty much only survives in the form of pouring one out for your homies. But the idea is that you make a little prayer. You say, "Please, elves, give me good luck," and then you pour some of your drink out on the ground, and then the elves drink your beer, right? Boasting. You tell mostly true stories about yourself. This is something they took very, very seriously, right? Because these were people who loved rhymes and poetry and stories, and so getting drunk and telling stories was a very solemn, very serious activity, right? And you were supposed to boast, you were supposed to go over the top because they would rather hear a good story than a boring true one, right? Oath swearing. This drinking game is one I made up, but you would swear an oath, and then you would finish your drink. And then if you choke on it, you'll fail to keep your promise. Ha ha ha. Swearing oaths was something they took very seriously in their culture. If you were someone who broke a promise, that was the absolute worst thing a human being could possibly be, was someone who swore an oath and then broke it. So whether it's swearing to be faithful to your spouse, or swearing to be loyal to a king or a lord, or swearing to avenge your brother's death or something, if you failed, that was just despicable, right? And it says that oath breakers sit at the base of the world tree and are gnawed by serpents. So don't break promises. Sumbel. So Sumbel is a very solemn drinking ritual in which sort of combines all of these activities. Sumbels are described as a group of people, usually very important men who have lots of money, would sit around because they're traveling from all over the country because not a lot of people had lots of money at that time, and they would pass around a giant horn, or they would all have their own horns, and they would take turns making toasts, swearing oaths to each other. But this was not as much fun as the rest of the drinking. This was a very serious thing. They viewed this as a religious event in a way. We can speculate more, but that's all you can really say for sure. I think that it has something to do with the idea that by drinking your beverage after swearing a promise at a Zoom bell, you're like dooming yourself to that promise, whether you like it or not. And so it's like you take it very seriously when you make a promise like that. Over time, Christianity gradually became the religion of Norse kings, and so became the religion of Norse people. Pagans readily adopted Christian practices due to the syncretic nature of their religion, and though Christianity reigned supreme, many pagan customs and rituals and beliefs and words have stayed with us to this day. So even though it is a dead religion, it lives on in many forms, some of them more clumsy than others, some of them more amusing than others. So that is the end of part 1. How's everybody doing? Part 2, this is going to be fun. We're going to talk about Norse mythology and the myth cycle. Oh, it says part 3. So, Norse mythology is their canon of stories, right? And we're going to explain what that means here in a second after I cover it a little bit more. And then we're going to read some myths. I brought one of my favorite children's books in the world, the Book of Norse Myths, and I'm going to use this to read the creation myth. And the rest of them I'm just going to ad-lib, so you're going to have to, it would take forever to actually read the whole book. Before we go on, we're going to talk about cyclical mythology. I apologize for this very long piece of writing, but I wanted to say exactly what I wanted to say, so I'm just going to read it to you. So if you don't like that it's on the screen, feel free to not look at the screen. So, cyclical mythology. Pre-Christian Norse people did not think of time in terms of linear events. They thought of time as a circle. As time goes on, we travel around the circle rather than forward in a line, right? This sense of time was built into their language as well as into their worldview. And it follows that Norse myths are not a linear series of events. They're a set of cyclical, multidimensional, overlapping, and often obscure stories that describe or explain things that happen in the world. They're largely based around cyclical and recurring events, such as the change of seasons, day and night, human emotions, life and death and rebirth, chaos and order, etc. They're not historical, nor are they empirical. By that I mean they are not meant to be seen that way. So, contrast. Christian mythology, if you're a young earth creationist, is a series of events that we can trace back in time to the beginning of the world, and everything happens one right after the other, and you can prove that it happened, right? But these myths are not that way. They are cyclical. So they didn't happen in the past. They are happening right now, and they're going to happen, and they have happened, right? They often overlap and contradict each other and contain paradoxical statements. It's not always a mistake so much as just a feature of the mythology, of this kind of mythology. Because every event that happens in the world has multiple mythical explanations, and every event, or every myth has multiple meanings. The events of every myth are ongoing and are constantly in the state of eternal recurrence. All things fade with time, but the cycle itself is eternal. So, to recap, Christian myths, linear, claimed historicity and empirical truth. Norse myths, cyclical, recurring, ahistorical. The meaning of the myths is obscured by time as well as by hard poetry. So not only do we not speak language and not always know what they're talking about, but the people writing it were poets, so they made it hard on purpose for poetic purposes. So it can be very difficult to read the text, but also just to interpret what happens in the story. Many of the myths casually refer to unknown or lost myths as if you should already know them, which is very difficult. And so some of the most famous stories that people know from Norse mythology are based on one line, right? For example, the story of the war between the Aesir and the Vanar gods. We only know that happened, or we only think we know that happened, because it's casually mentioned, after the war between the Aesir and the Vanar. It's like, oh, all right. Just got to deal with the limited resources. Myths have different meanings and take different forms for different tribes and individuals. So, some myths you find all over the Germanic world, some myths you only find in one place. Some myths are the same in two different places, but have different meanings. You have to use your imagination. You must use your imagination if you want to interpret it, because if you don't, then you're just stuck with a bunch of really confusing text. So, if we don't do that for other mythologies, we don't do that for Greek mythology. Say, well, we just have a bunch of confusing text, so we're going to not make any inferences as to what the story means. No, we keep going. So that's what we have to do with Norse myths. So without further ado, now that I've bored you all to death, boom! The Norse creation myth. I'm going to be reading from this book. How do I turn this screen? I see it. Okay. I really love this book. So, I don't know if you guys can read the text, but all that matters is that you can see the pictures. So, the big book of Norse myths. We're going to start with the creation myth. It seems like a good place to start. Believe it or not, even though this is a beginning myth, it is also a cyclical myth. And that's something to think about as we work our way through it. Let me cut out for a second. The first gods and giants. Early in the morning of time, there was no sand, no grass, no lapping wave. There was no earth, no sun, no moon, no stars. There was Niflheim, a waste of frozen fog, and Muspelheim, a place of raging flames. And in between the fog and fire, there was a gaping pit, Ginnungagap. Ginnungagap means a gaping nothing, literally. So, spooky. For untold ages, the crackling embers of Muspelheim and the crystals of ice from Niflheim whirled around in the dark and dismal pit. As they whirled together faster and faster, fire kindled and sparked life within the ice. An enormous, ugly shape rose roaring from Ginnungagap. It was the first frost giant, Ymir, first of the race of Jotuns. At his side, a hornless ice cow came mooing from the pit. Together, Jotun and cow lived on the rim of Ginnungagap. The Jotun did not lack for food. 4 rivers of snow-white froth flowed like milk from the huge ice cow's udder, and Ymir drank and drank and grew to a towering height. As for the cow, she found plenty of food licking the salty brim of Ginnungagap. For a long time, there were only Ymir and the cow. Then Ymir fell into a deep sleep. While he slept, a male and female Jotun came to life in the warmth of his left armpit. And then a troll with 6 heads sprouted from his feet. These monstrous creatures grew quickly and had offspring of their own. They were all big and rough, and Ymir was the biggest and wildest of them all. These were the first giants, and we'll be learning more about them later. The ice cow also brought about life. As she licked and licked the salty brine, her tongue grew warm, for she had to lick hard to make enough food for Ymir and his brood. Then, under her warm tongue, a head of hair sprouted on the tiny brim. And then she went on licking, and a face appeared. The cow went right on licking. Shoulders and chest came forth, then legs, and at last stepped out a whole new creature. He was straight and tall and quite handsome, not ugly like the Jotuns and the trolls. He had a son who was even more handsome, and the son took for his wife a beautiful Jotun maiden. And it sometimes happened that an ugly frost giant would have a lovely daughter. She bore her husband 3 sons who were so fair that a radiance spread from about them, lit up the darkness around them. They were the first of the great Aesir gods. Their names were Odin, Honor, and Loder, spirit, will, and warmth. The original names were Odin, Vili, and Ve. I don't know why they used these here. They were high and very holy, and they had the power to create a world. Look how pretty they are. But before the three gods could begin to create, they had to get rid of the frost giant Ymir. He had always been wild, and old age had made him worse. So the three young Aesir gods went against the age-old Jotun. They slew Ymir and pushed his huge hulk into Ginnungagap, and so much brine flowed from his wounds that it filled up the pit and flooded over the rim. The cow and all of Ymir's offspring were drowned, except for two, a very strong Jotun and his mate. They clambered up onto the ice floes and went on to live on the wild outer shores of the sea made by Ymir's brine. The Aesir did not pursue them, and almost right away this icebound wilderness, Jotunheim, was teeming with their offspring. These uncouth Jotuns and trolls hated the Aesir for what they had done to their kinsmen. They watched as the handsome gods made a new world and raged among themselves. The Aesir raised Ymir's body out of the sea and made Midgard, the earth, from it. Ymir's flesh became the soil, his bones the mountains, his teeth boulders and stones. They pushed desolate Niflheim deep underground where its icy fog could not freeze the earth. And over land and sea they set Ymir's huge skull as the dome of the sky, so that the sparks from Muspelheim would not set the new world on fire. I'm going to skip some of this. They also created the sun and the moon and set them in order. Just lovely painting here. I love myself. Then they made the stars, who were called the Light Elves, and they made the dwarves underground, and they made the animals. And then the Aesir realized that they had made all these things, and yet there was nobody to marvel at them. So one day, Odin, Vili, and Ve were walking around on the beach, and they saw two misshapen logs lying on the beach. Odin decided to turn these logs into the first human beings. So he walked up to them and he breathed life into them, and they came alive, and they were called Ask and Embla. Ask and Embla were both ugly and gnarled, but they were the first humans, so Odin loved them, and he taught them wisdom. And their children were slightly better looking, and their children were even better looking. And soon we had lovely, normal-looking human beings. So that is the end of the creation. Analysis. So what do you guys think of that myth? My animations aren't working, so I'm going to change that. What do you guys think? What do you think it means?
I think it's just all one big sexual innuendo.
What's the sexual innuendo with taking someone, dismantling them, and making them move?
Licking and licking until it was a hair.
I'm saying that art sexual innuendo.
I found it interesting. I don't know like the Bible context of teaching was, so but I don't know if it was the words that love or zero usage of the word, like breathe life into them. I thought that was interesting because in Christianity, that's what God, if you breathe life into man.
I'm glad you asked that because it actually is very interesting. So Odin's name. Is there a marker?
That one sucks.
That thing in the wall.
So Odin's name in Old Norse is written this way.
Of course.
Odin. Right? The root of this word is Other, which I think we talked about this earlier. It means poet, right? The root of this word in Proto-Germanic is Woj. which means to give. It means giver. It's hard to say in English. It means he gives passion, right? So wort is like religious passion, right? Like The root of that word in Proto-Indo-European is wet. And this word means breath. And so Odin is descended from whatever god had the word wet in his name. And so the idea is that all these different aspects are carried over as the myths evolve over time. So this story of Odin breathing life into people probably existed, thousands of years before, but in a slightly different form. And over time it changes like a game of telephone. So I find it really interesting that the idea of being insane, won't, and being poetic and having the breath of life are all sort of combined into this one god. I think that's really interesting. But we can only speculate. So, anybody else thoughts on that?
Does this have anything to do with PIE?
Yeah, that's PIE. I think I put the star on the wrong side. This side. But, Proto-Indo-European. It's a reconstructed language that takes all the modern Indo-European languages and tries to trace them all the way back. Okay, so Ginnunga Gap is a realm of nothingness, right? There's nothing there. It's, there's fire and mist, but it's supposed to be nothing, right? Into nothing comes chaos. So Ymir is a giant. Giants in the Norse myth cycle, they represent chaos, right? They represent forces of nature that are destructive. Ice, rock slides, raging rivers, those are things that giants do. Ymir and his children, it says this, by the way, is not the real story. It's a kid's version of the story, so don't take any one line of this book too seriously. So they turned Ginnunga Gap into a place of chaos where there was nothing. The cow is a pastoral animal, right? And it's one that these people probably would have taken pretty seriously in their daily lives. They probably had cows, they probably drank milk, and so for them it sort of symbolizes life and order, right? So they have the cow give birth to the gods. The gods, or the Aesir in their mythology, represent order. They represent things that are constructive and that create and that make the world not chaotic and that make it more beautiful. Rain, thunder, life, fertility, calm seas, warmth. And so the gods go to war with the giants and win, and they create the world, right? And then Odin breathes life into the first humans. We already talked about this a little bit. And that's why he's called the Allfather, because he's the one who breathes life into people. The breath also refers to inspiration or spiritual insight. Oh, you guys can't see my slides. Now I feel stupid. So, it's just all the stuff I just said. So, the wet refers to inspiration and spiritual insight. So now we're going to talk about a couple of myths of Odin. I'm just going to ad-lib and go through them quickly. So, how Odin lost his eye. Once upon a time, Odin decided he wanted to learn more things about the world. And so he set about learning secrets. He would send his 2 ravens out into the world to find secrets, and they would fly back and whisper the secrets into his ear. And it was from his ravens that he learned that there was a wise Jotun called Mimir living in Jotunheim. Deep in Jotunheim, at the base of the world tree, almost. And so Odin resolves to go and meet Mimir. He goes to Mimir's well, for a well Mimir lived in, and he notices that Mimir gains all of his wisdom from being immersed in the well. So he asks him, "Can I have a drink from your well?" And Mimir says, "No." And so Odin asks him again, Can I have a drink from your well? And Mimir says, nope, once again. So Odin asks a third time, and Mimir says, okay, but you can only have a drink if you give me one of your eyes. So Odin thinks about this for a second, and so he cuts out one of his eyes, and he casts it into the well of Mim, and in exchange, Mimir passes him a horn full of the magic mead that is inside the well. And Odin drinks the mead, and ever after, he was called very wise. Another myth about mead and wisdom, and then we're going to now analyze these after. Odin steals the magic mead. So, once upon a time, there was a very wise spirit called Kvasir. Kvasir was the essence of wisdom. He was the wisest being that ever existed. He lived inside of a big pot because it was the only way he could contain all of his wisdom. Otherwise, it would leak out. One day, a bunch of greedy dwarves learned about this wise spirit, and so they went and they drowned him in his own kettle and his own knowledge. And then they stole it and took it with them down into their dwarf hole. A giant family lived nearby. The dwarves got cocky and they decided to murder these giants. And this made their son, who was a giant called Suttung, very angry. So he went to the dwarves' hole, and the dwarves, being a bunch of little cowards, said, "Please don't hurt us!" And so Suttung said, "I'll only let you live if you give me the mead." And so he took the mead, which was the melted down essence of the spirit Kvasir, back to his house. He poured the mead into 3 kettles, and he had his daughter Gunnlaug guard them. Odin learned of this through the whispers, and being a very greedy god, Odin decided he wanted the mead of wisdom for himself. So he turned into an eagle, and he flew to Suttung's house, and he snuck into the room where Gunnlaug was guarding the kettles. He then turned into a very handsome man and said to Gunnlaug, "Oh, Gunnlaug, won't you please let me have just a sip of the magic mead?" And then she was smitten by his beauty because he made himself very beautiful. And she said, "Okay, but you can only have 1 sip from each kettle." Little did she know, Odin can shapeshift. So he takes each kettle and he drinks them in 1 gulp. He takes 3 gulps and drinks all 3 of the kettles down. And then with his jowls full of mead, he turns back into an eagle and flies away. Suttung sees this and gets angry, and he turns into an eagle and chases Odin. But Odin was a faster eagle, so he escaped. While Odin was flying, his jowls were bouncing up and down, and so some of the mead of wisdom fell out and landed in Midgard. This is why some people are bad poets, because they find the mead laying on the ground. So he returns to Asgard, and he demands that the gods get a barrel. I imagine he said, "Barrel!" And then he, as in the picture, spits all the mead out. And so that is how Odin came in possession of the magic mead. And ever after, every word he spoke was in stately, poetic verse. So, what does it mean?
I just have a quick comment/question. So in Eastern Europe, there was a beverage called kvass, and it's similar to mead. And after hearing that, I'm pretty sure there's a reason. They're probably connected to some.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would be shocked I wouldn't be surprised if they were. I don't know, but I should look into that. Yes.
I don't know too much about this, but I know that the Vikings actually had quite a strong hand in founding of Russian societies.
Yep.
So that maybe don't you think between.
Yeah, it might be. They considered mead to be a very specific sort of thing. They associated it with wisdom and with poetry and things like that. So, myth analysis. So what does it mean? So, Odin was worshipped by poets, artists, and scholars who wanted a drink of his magic mead, right? So since Odin has the mead, he has the ability to give the gift of poetry. And he got mead from two places. He got it from the well, and he stole it from the giant. But like I said, these myths overlap, and they sometimes contradict each other. But it's not so much like a mistake as that all that really matters is that Odin has mead. It doesn't really matter where he got it, right? And people believe both of these stories at the same time, right? These are two of the most popular myths, and you see them referenced together in sagas and stuff all the time. And they didn't see any problem believing that he got the mead both by stealing it and from the well. So the mead that he gets from the well does not just refer to a well that happens to, exist. It's referring to the great well at the base of the world tree. So this is some of the really difficult content, so I won't go too far into it, but basically, the well represents all of the collected wisdom of the past, and also the past, right? So, to glimpse the well, or to get a sip from the well, is like to get a dose of the great cosmic wisdom of eternity, things like that. So it has a very particular sort of meaning. By drinking the mead from the well, Odin gains deep cosmic wisdom and inspiration, right? So not only does he gain wisdom, but he gains inspiration, and he starts speaking in poetic verses. Because for them, those things kind of go hand in hand, because they value poetry highly. It may also only be that we have poetry, and so the people who wrote down the Norse myths were poets, and they thought very highly of poetry. So Odin might, on a whim, give a person a drink of the mead, filling them with inspiration. If you read skaldic poems from the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, a lot of them will start out with a few lines that say, "I was struck by a burst of the great mead from Odin," or something like that. And the idea is like they're saying, I'm writing this poem because I got some inspiration. And to say I'm inspired for them was saying, I got a drink of Odin's magic mead. Worshippers of Odin might also hope that by worshipping Odin, he would give them inspiration and help them to be poets. Odin also hanged himself on the world tree in order to gain wisdom. That is a difficult myth. If we have time, maybe we'll talk about it. It's my favorite, personally. But this is why it's called Yggdrasil, which means Odin's horse, because he rode the tree, right? Ig is the name of Odin. It means the terrible one. So, Odin has got a poetry, but he's also got a death, and battle, and war, and terrible events, and fate, and luck. So, he's a spooky guy. He's a good god for Halloween. So moving on from Odin, well, anyone have cues about those myths or those ideas? No, nobody? No, it's fine. So some myth describes ritual. So this is a popular idea in folklore studies that myths do not come out of thin air. It's not like somebody just made up a story. It's more like people made up a story based on things that they were already doing, right? So, for example, at Christmas time, we've been giving each other presents and putting up trees for thousands of years, but we don't know why. If you ask people now, they'll say, oh, it's because of Santa Claus, because we made up a myth, right? That's kind of how a lot of these myths develop. Some myths may have been very specific religious rituals. They're even written in screenplay format, like they'd be reading them back and forth, one character to the next. This was very common in ancient Greek society, where at festivals around the year, they would perform plays where they would reenact myths. In fact, all Greek plays originated this way as religious rituals. It started out with one person reciting a poem, and then a second person came and made it into a dialogue, and then they started getting creative with the scripts, and that's how ancient Greek drama developed. But one myth that I think is a good example of this, nobody knows for sure, obviously, we just know that we have a myth and it's written in screenplay format, is the story of Frey and Gerd. This is a kind of a fun one. So, Once upon a time, Frey was walking around in Asgard, and he noticed that Odin's magic high seat was empty. Odin had a high seat called Lidskjalf, which means high seat, where he would sit and he could look out into all the 9 worlds and learn secrets. Frey saw his opening and he jumped up and sat in the chair, and he looked out. First, he looked up to the top of the tree where he saw the great eagle that beats its wings and creates storm winds. And then he looked down to the roots of the world and saw the world serpents circling the roots. And then he looked into Jotunheim and he saw the most beautiful giant maiden he had ever seen. He was so taken with her beauty that he was immediately head over heels in love. But, alas, she could not love him because she was frozen solid. Her entire body, indeed her very heart, was a frozen husk, unable to move or feel anything. This made Frey very sad. And so Frey began moping around Asgard and was unable to perform his godly duties, such as impregnating the earth to make it fertile. And so the gods got together to discuss this. They said, all right, Frey's kind of fucked up, so we got to figure out how we can make things better. And they resolved to send Frey's faithful servant, Skirnir, into Jotunheim to convince Gerd to marry him. So Skirnir rides his horse into Jotunheim, and he comes to Gerd's house. And he says to her, Gerd, will you please marry Frey, for he loves you very much? And she says, I can't. So he asks her a second time, Gerd, will you please marry Frey? He loves you very much. She says, I can't. The third time, Skirnir doesn't ask. He says, Gerd, so help me, if you don't marry Frey, I will put the worst curse on you that has ever been cursed. You will be gnawed by the serpents at the root of the world for all eternity, and your ancestors will be trolls if you do not marry Frey. And so she says, okay. And so he puts the frozen giantess on his horse and rides back to Asgard. And she and Frey are married. And alas, it was a very happy marriage, for Frey loved her very much, and she loved him. And when she felt Frey's love, her frozen body melted, and so did her frozen heart, and they lived happily ever after. Oh, and she became very green and happy. So, what does it mean? Yes! So, Gerd is an ice giant who is literally a frozen husk for a heart, and Frey is the god of fertility and springtime. Gerd likely represents the cold of winter, and by threatening her into becoming Frey's wife, Skirnir is helping to end the winter, basically, and to bring about spring. Skirnir maybe represents like a worshiper of Frey, and by performing the ritual roast of Gerd, he is, let's imagine, put our speculation hats on, and imagine that every year they perform this ceremony where they reenact the courtship of Gerd. They probably would have believed that by reenacting this ceremony, they were making the springtime come, because they were threatening the winter into obscurity. So, it's an interesting theory. Don't know if it's correct, of course, we can only speculate. But any thoughts on this story? It's a very, without the season-changing concepts, it just comes off as a very bizarre, sexist story. But, even with the season-changing concepts, it kind of still does. Yeah. It's fun. Odin hangs himself on the world tree. I'm going to come back to this one if we have time, because this one is very difficult. Thor goes fishing for the world serpent. This is a fun myth. So this is part of a longer myth, which I'm going to omit. I'll just start at the interesting part. So Thor and Frey went into Jotunheim to meet with a giant called Hymir because they wanted to take his magic cauldron, which brewed infinite amounts of beer. But Hymir would not give it to them, and so they were sort of at an impasse. And so one day Hymir says, Thor, let's go fishing. So they go fishing to catch some whales for dinner. They go out onto the boat, and they cast out their lines, and Hymir catches 2 whales. And he says, ha ha ha, look at me. Hymir's a giant, by the way. Thor throws out his line, and suddenly everything gets spooky. And it turns out he's hooked the world serpent. And so Thor pulls up, and suddenly he's got this terrible monster on the end of his hook. The world serpent is Thor's mortal enemy for all time, and so this is an epic battle about to happen. Thor pulls out his hammer and throws it at the snake, and hits it right in the middle of its head, and it shakes it off and keeps coming. And so Hymir gets scared and cuts the rope, and the serpent sinks down to the bottom of the ocean again. Thor is very mad. He's so mad that he eats the 2 whales by himself. That's the end of the fishing part. The rest of the myth is just given. So, what does it mean? So, the world serpent seems to represent the entire myth cycle and sort of the inevitability of Ragnarok. The inevitability that the cycle will come all the way around at some point. My interpretation is that nothing in the world lasts forever. The end will eventually come, but it's only going to come when it is ready to come. So, Thor is the most powerful of all the gods. He kills so many giants just by hitting them with his hammer once. And he flings the hammer at the world serpent and crashes into its head and it does nothing. So even the most powerful of all the gods cannot defeat the world serpent, Jormungand, until Ragnarok. So the idea is that the cycle is pretty much unbreakable until it's supposed to be broken, or until it's supposed to reach its natural conclusion. The death of Baldur. This is a sad story. A very sad story. So, once upon a time, there was the god Baldur. Baldur was Odin's favorite son. Baldur was the most beautiful of all the gods. Period. No god or goddess was as beautiful as Baldur. He was also the most loved. He was the god of light. He was the god of youth and beauty, and everyone loved him. And he was also immortal. The gods one day were decided to play a game. They thought, Baldur is immortal, let's throw spears at him because they won't hurt him. And so they all took turns throwing spears at him, thinking, hey, this is fun, yeah. And then the trickster god Loki, who hated Baldur, got a mean idea in his head. And he crafted a special missile that could actually kill Baldur because it had Loki's tricky spells on it. And he gave the missile to the blind god, Hod, and said, here, Hod, you throw one at Baldur now. And Hod said, whoa, I don't know, I can't see. And Loki says, don't worry, I'll point you in the right direction. So he turns Hod at Baldur. And Baldur's got his big, beautiful smile on his face, because the gods are playing a game. And then Hod lunges and throws the most perfect throw you've ever seen a blind man make of a spear. And suddenly, Baldur is dead. It's very sad. The entire world weeps at his death. They're so sad. Every creature, every tree, and every rock weeps for Baldur. So they have a funeral, and Baldur is sent to Hell on a burning ship. Hell with one L, which is just the place where dead people go. Odin is so distraught over this that he decides to ride to Hell to try to rescue Baldur and bring him back. So Odin jumps on his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, and rides to Hell. And when he gets to Hell, he begs Hel, who is also a giantess and a place. He begs Hel to let Baldur go. He says, please, please, let Baldur go. And Hel says, nope. She laughs at him and she says, he will only come when you come to replace him at Ragnarok. Which is so spooky. Actually, I skipped part of the story. So before she says he can't come back till Ragnarok, she says, I will let Baldur go if you can get every living and non-living thing in the world to cry for him. And so the gods go around trying to get everybody to cry for Baldur. right? And then they come to this wicked old woman who is just super mean. And Freya says, "Won't you please cry for Baldur so he can come back?" And she says, "No, what's he ever done for me?" That old woman was actually Loki in disguise. And so Odin goes back and he learns that Baldur cannot come back until Ragnarok. So what does it mean? Well, yeah. So Baldur is the god of light. So think about it in the cyclical way. So it's not just an event that happened in the myth story. It's referring to, it's a metaphor for other things. So if Baldur's the god of light, and he dies, the whole world cries. So what does that mean? Think about where they live. They live in a temperate climate, sort of like we have in Minnesota, where we have 4 seasons, where the leaves change colors in fall, and where the winter comes, and where the days grow darker. As the year wanes, the day grows dark and cold, and the light has less power. The myth may be referring to the change of seasons into winter. When Baldur dies, it's paving the way for darkness and cold, because he's the god of light. And when the god of light dies, what hope is there for the rest of us, right? After Ragnarok, Baldur can return. Maybe this refers to the return of the spring. I think that seems pretty obvious. Some people don't agree. So, yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Could this have to do with the fact that certainly through latitudes there's experience of months when there's absolute zero.
Yeah, it could. I think it's possible, but unlikely, just because for most of where people live in Scandinavia, it's not like that. Usually the places where that darkness occurs are inhabited by Sami peoples and by Finns and by Laplanders and other folks that are not Norse, but could be. Anybody else? Yeah. Going once? So, we've got time. I'm going to talk about Odin on the Tree. This is my favorite myth. This is probably the most obscure and difficult myth in the entire set of myths. So, and it's also coincidentally my favorite. So, I'm going to read one interpretation of this. It's almost a direct translation. It's written in prose, though, but I like it. So, the setting for this story is that Odin wants to gain wisdom, and he decides to hang himself on a tree. And so Odin said, "I know that I hung on the wind-battered tree. I hung there for 9 long nights. I was pierced by a spear. I was an offering to Odin, myself to myself. No one has ever known or will ever know the roots of that ancient tree. No one came to comfort me with bread. No one revived me with a drink from a horn. I peered at the worlds below. I seized the runes. Shrieking, I seized them, and then I fell back. From Bolthor's famous son, Bestla's father, which is also Odin, I learned 9 powerful songs. I was able to drain the precious mead from the cauldron Odrorir. Then I began to thrive, and my wisdom grew. I prospered and was fruitful. One word gained me many words. One deed gained me many deeds." So what does it mean? Any ideas? Well, his name literally means the mad one in some languages. So let's unpack this a little bit. Here's my interpretation. I think this is sort of a novel interpretation. Other than me and a friend of mine who have written a paper about this, I don't think anyone has thought of it this way. Odin is telling you and I how to gain wisdom. So, wisdom's probably not worth it if it means hanging on a tree, right? But I don't think it's restricted to hanging on a tree. So, when Odin hangs himself on the tree, he's subjecting himself to a test, right? To a challenge, right? He's putting himself through an experience that is difficult and painful, and that changes him. After the experience, he is, filled with inspiration, right? By sacrificing himself to himself, he means, I think, that the person he was before he went on the tree is gone and cannot come back. But the gain of that sacrifice is wisdom, right? He suffers on the tree, and it puts him into an altered state of consciousness where he's likely to have insights. This is a common theme in many religions all over the world, that you gain wisdom through altered states of consciousness or being. That's why all over the world, when people want to have religious experiences, they starve themselves, they fast, they sing songs, they chant, they use hallucinogenic drugs, they make pilgrimages where they walk incredibly long distances, and they do that because they hope that in this intense experience, they're going to have an insight that will make them wiser, right? In Martin Heidegger's philosophy, this insight is called the event, right? And it refers to an experience that changes a person forever and that they spend the rest of their life trying to figure out, right? James Joyce would call it an epiphany, right? And so you do these things, you endure this trial so that you can, during the trial or after the trial, you can see the runes, you can see the writing written, on the wall or in your mind, you see the insight, right? And when you see it, when you get inspired, now remember, poetic and spiritual inspiration go together in this. So he says, this translation said word followed word, but a better translation is poem followed after poem, or verse followed after verse, and deed followed after deed. And so the inspiration caused him to just overflow with poetic verses and with beautiful ideas and insights, right? And if people challenge themselves in this way too, they can also have these moments of inspiration. So that is my obscure interpretation of this obscure myth. So, what do you guys think?
I would actually, you were going to do any other more comment. You said this apparently, so are there any more common interpretations from you?
Usually people just say we don't know, or he did it so that he could discover the rune letters and give the letters to people, which I think is kind of it just seems simplistic. Yeah.
It reminds me of Socrates and Plato, where Socrates takes kind of shoves its face from the desire of knowledge or whatever, and there's that under there.
That's actually a great comparison. I'll have to keep that in mind. I like it. It gets into the existentialism a little bit. It's kind of a different Norse existentialism, because the kind I talked about the previous time I gave this talk was more focused on the heroic mindset, whereas this is about poetry. So, very cool. Okay, now we come to the last myth, Ragnarok. This is a very problematic and very misunderstood myth, but it kicks ass. So we're going to talk about it. It's a misunderstood myth because people tend to think of it as being just like the Christian end times, like the universe is going to end and it's going to be final. But like all the other myths, it's a cyclical myth. It's a recurring concept. Right? How can that be? Let's find out. So, the story of Ragnarok comes to us in the form of a prophecy given by a dead witch that Odin has raised from the dead. Odin goes down to the roots of the world to where the grave of this witch is, and he brings gold bracelets and arm rings as an offering so that she can give him wisdom. And he casts them at her grave, and she rises up and she says, "Who has wakened me?" And then she sees Odin, and she acknowledges his offering, and she decides to start seeing for him. So she's a seeress. That means she, and sees things happening. So first, she sees, and she relays to Odin, she sees the creation of the world. She sees the creation of the gods and of mankind. She sees the roots of the world, and she sees the top of the world. She sees all the 9 worlds and all the creatures that live there. Then she sees the gods doing their things. She sees the giant who built Asgard, but then the gods betrayed him and kicked him out because they didn't want to force Freya to marry him. And then she sees Thor fighting giants. And then she sees Baldur being slain. And then she sees Odin hiding his eye in the well. And then she sees something spooky. She sees the army, she sees Heimdall go down to the roots of the tree and pull out his great horn called the Gjallar horn and blow it. When he blows this horn, it symbolizes the doom of the gods is approaching. And Heimdall blows his horn, and at the same time, the great wolf Fenrir howls and runs free. And then the army of giants from Jotunheim and Niflheim and Muspelheim all come together and go to Midgard to attack the gods and to destroy the world. They sail on a giant ship made out of toenails. They arrive in Midgard, and the gods are ready for them, and they fight a great battle. Each of them fights their nemesis. Odin fights against Fenrir the wolf and is killed, and then he's avenged by his son Hod. By his son Hod. Then Thor is fighting the world serpent, and he kills him with his hammer, but he gets poisoned, and he dies afterwards from his wounds. Frey dies in a battle with Surt. Surt is a great fire giant with a massive flaming sword that he sweeps to and fro and cuts at the roots of the world tree. The entire world shakes and is in terrible chaos. The tree sinks down into the mists of Ginnungagap, and all is dark. And then a new day dawns. Yggdrasil grows tall and green again, and the sun and the moon return. The eagles fly around the mountains looking for food. Baldur and Hod return from hell and dwell in Odin's hall and sit at ease. Once again, the world serpent slithers down and circles around the tree. So, pretty grim stuff, right? People have interpreted it as being like the Christian end times, like I said. But like I said, that's a mistake, because like everything else, it's cyclical, right? So the tree rises up again, and some of the gods come back, and it's green again. And the idea is that another Ragnarok will happen in the future, and another Ragnarok, and another Ragnarok. And it just keeps going, and it's inevitable. It's part of this terrible cycle, right? It's a myth about the literal end of the world, but it's also a myth about the end of anything that ends. So lots of things in life come to ends, right? This talk is going to come to an end. The day comes to an end. The month comes to an end. The year comes to an end. Our lives come to an end. Civilizations come to an end. Everything ends, right? And when the end comes, there might be a period of darkness, but there's always a recurrence of something that replaces it, whether it's the birth of a new child, or the rising of a new sun, or the creation of a new country out of the old ones that were destroyed. Baldur's return could represent the return of spring after winter. It could also just mean it gets better. Ragnarok may have been marked as a yearly occurrence, like the change of seasons. So this is kind of a shaky theory, but it may be true that, like the other scripted myth, that they might have reenacted a battle between gods and giants at the Yule festival to mark like the end of the winter. We don't know that. That's kind of a shaky theory, but it's one possibility, because we do know that myth often describes rituals. So that's all I have to say about Ragnarok. I ideas before I do my conclusion. Call it a day. How's everybody doing? Pretty good? You guys bored of me yet? Yeah? Okay. So I can sing afterwards. We got time. So I like to summarize with this final quote from the website Norse-Mythology.org, which is an okay page, but I like this quote. The cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth, for which the Norse mythology provides an archetype, occurs at every scale of life and existence. I made up a word there. The cycle of seasons, of day and night, of the phases of the moon, of the life of any organism, and of the flourishing of life between mass extinctions. The twilight of the gods, in other words, expresses the meaning that pre-Christian Norse people perceived within every physical twilight, every autumn, every waning moon, and every aging being. This, finally, is the heart of the pre-Christian worldview of the Norse and other Germanic peoples. By imbuing existence with these sacred meanings, they sanctified all of existence. And if they kept the proper mindset and lived their lives immersed in the sacred at every turn, they could say, along with William Blake, everything that is holy. So, that's the end. Tusen takk, gute natt. Questions, comments, concerns? That? Yes.
So, in certain East Asian philosophies, religions, for that matter, there's this concept of separate beings. For example, in Buddhism, there's this idea that people are in this constant cycle of birth, death, rebirth, that type of thing. And the end goal is to kind of escape that or in certain perceptions of time systems, accepting that, kingdoms fall, and changes. But in those perceptions, there's this idea that things still progress, but that change is more of this aesthetic thing than this permanent. Would you say that in Norse mythology, there's this idea that things can still change, but ultimately they remain the same? Or is it more that change is an illusion, and at times it's the same thing that keeps happening?
It's hard to say. I don't think we have enough information to say either way. I think it's probably more likely that they thought that things change, but the cycle stays the same, because they did keep track of history in their own way. They were very fond of lineages and of legends of things that they believed were historical. Like, they loved the story of Attila the Hun, and they loved the myth of Sigurd, and they thought that those things really happened, right? But yeah, I don't think they had ideas like change is an illusion. I think that's a little bit more Near East and Far Eastern. Hi.
So that thing reminded me of who here is familiar with the Slaughterhouse Five. So Joe, this Joe, have you heard of this?
Long time ago in high school.
Okay. It made me think of that in the sense that in their story there are aliens who kind of also see time as just a cycle. And so I just really thought of that, and it's like, oh, Star Wars 5 the entire time.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it, because we know that their gods were bound by time, but the Norns, the three spinners who weave the destinies of the world, are sort of deeply immersed inside the well of time. So they could be thought of to be sort of outside time, or like they control time. It's very spooky.
So, I didn't want to jump in while you're giving the talk, but when you're talking about giving offerings, what exactly was it to give an offering? I don't think there was a concrete definition, or is there a concrete definition? Because I know you talked about giving, material things for a live animal. How would one go about doing that?
It probably varied from place to place and time to time, but the general idea is like you say a prayer to the being that you're making an offering to, and then you give it to them. So you might have like an altar of Thor or something, and if you wanted to make an offering, you would, you might have like a little bowl, and you'd pour your alcoholic beverage into it, and say, this is for you, and then you just leave it. Or if you're sacrificing an animal, you might kill them and you put their blood in the bowl, and then you would cook the animal and eat it, right? Because you want the blessing from it. Some offerings are more fuzzy, or are more not fuzzy. They're more. That's sad, actually. There's different ways. One. I can't remember what the source is. It's either a saga or a poem. I mean, sagas are poems. But anyway, it says that if you're injured in battle, you can make an offering to the elves by putting bread in a circle around a hill that was outside of a particular village. And that was an offering to the elves in the hopes that they'll heal your battle wound. I imagine every place had their own notion of what it was to give an offering, but it's a custom that you can trace all over the world and all the way back through time. Like, people have been doing that for very, very many thousands of years.
What was the Norse concept of morality? Did they have one, or did it just vary from various groups to various groups?
It varied. I mean, they probably had a concept of morality that was very much about what is natural and what is good for their tribe, because they were tribal peoples. What was good was what made the tribe strong and the individual strong. What was bad was what was, what hurt a family or a tribe, or what was detrimental to an individual. It's hard to say, because a lot of the morality problems that we deal with in the current year are so far removed from medieval village life that it's hard to talk about modern morality plays the same way.
So, how exactly, being that all these myths are cyclical, how exactly do you reconcile the quote-unquote creation myth with Ragnarok?
Well, creation happens after destruction.
Right, but at the end of the Ragnarok myth, it was a new day, the sun came up again, and it wasn't an empty, barren wasteland like it was with the one frost giant and the cow.
Well, like I said early in the myth part, that myths are not thought of as empirical in the way that Christian myths are. So, it's not like they thought, okay, so Ragnarok happens, and then the giant comes back, and then the cow comes back, and then the cow creates the gods again, and then this happens. Like that, they would have thought that was total, meaningless to talk about. Like Ragnarok happens, and then creation happens again. That's probably where they'd leave it off. They were very, uninterested, I think, in the sort of empirical analysis of trying to construct a closed system. Maybe that's not true for all of them, but we definitely don't have enough information to create a closed system from what they have. So, is it ogre? Okay, thank you very much.
Stop recording, please.